Hello and welcome to my channel. Have you ever imagined as a project team or even as a project manager, how are you going to manage the uncertainty in the project? What is called risk management. Don't look elsewhere. In this video, I'm going to take you through all that you need to manage uncertainty in a project. That is risk management. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Oscar Mbira. I'm a certified program and project manager. In this video, I'm going to take you through the process of managing uncertainty in a project, which is called risk management. So I would advise you watch this video all the way up to the end, because at the end of this video, you are going to gain a lot of knowledge. You are going to get a blueprint in terms of what you need to manage uncertainty in a project from the start of the project, all the way to the end of the project. So let's dive in. So let's start with the definition of risk in a project. There are a number of definitions for risk. However, what I'm going to share with you is the definition which I think is very much oriented towards project management. So what is a risk in a project? A risk in a project is a future event or a group or a set of events. If they occur, they are going to affect the achievement of the project objectives. So let me say it again. A risk in a project is a future event or a set of events. If they occur, they are going to affect the project objectives. So, depending on where you're coming from, or depending on the organization, some organizations, or even some sections of the industry, they are still classifying a risk as either a positive risk or a negative risk. So you might be wondering in terms of what is a positive risk and what is a negative risk. So a negative risk is something that is going to affect the project, which means what can go wrong. So that is the negative risk. There are also cases where you have a positive risk and you might want to capitalize on it. For example, a certain event in the future, from the definition that I've earlier articulated, a certain event in the future might also provide an opportunity, either for a new project, for new business, or even to accelerate the current project. So you should be able to distinguish the two. Although in most cases, risk is normally looked at as a negative impact to the project. So we are going to discuss more details as we go through the video. We are going to dive more into this positive, which we call opportunities, and also the negative part of the risks, which we call the threats. So let's move on. I hope you have enjoyed the video so far. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you are the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help this channel to produce more videos like this one. Now, after understanding what is a risk in a project, we also need to appreciate how does it impact the project? Why is it necessary for someone to know or to understand risk management or management of uncertainty? So every project is exposed to so many challenges. Some of them are known as you start the project. Some of them you get to know them as you move from one stage to the other or from one phase to the other. From my experience, most of these risks, they are not very easy to identify, but in some cases, they are very easy to identify. But however, what I normally do when I'm starting a project is to make sure that I have a risk workshop. So you might be asking, what is this risk workshop that I'm talking about or that I'm referring to? So a risk workshop, the way I normally conduct it, I pick the key project members or team leaders who are going to contribute much into the project per each and every area, which I normally call a work stream. A work stream is just a specialized or a divided or categorized area which is expected to be producing certain deliverables in a project. So I identify workstream leads and also key project members, like for example, the ones from ICT, from finance, from quality assurance, from audit, from compliance, and so on and so forth. So once I have these teams in place, we go into a workshop. The purpose of the workshop is to take through the team the risk cycle in a project. We are going to discuss more about the risk cycle in the next sections of the video. So during the risk workshop, the process is to identify the risk and also to assess the impact. Since most of these participants in this workshop, They are more on the technical side of knowing the impact and also the probability of the risk to occur. It is very important that you take note and you listen to them as a project manager. The information they give you at that point might be based on a experience, it could be based on some studies, and so on and so forth. So you need to listen to them if you're a project manager. You pick the risks, you identify them, you categorize them, you also identify how are you going to respond to each and every risk. We're going to go deeper into the categories and also the risk responses that you can also provide in the risk management process. So one of the advantages of having this risk workshop during the start of the initiation stage of the project is it also serves two purposes. The first purpose is you are going to be able to identify and also prepare most of these risks for the future of the project. Then the second part of it is also going to work as a learning process for the participants. They are going to appreciate what is going to be the risks in the project, and also instead of just relying on the risk register, which we're going to discuss more again, they are also going to take it from day one, what they have to do, what they have to manage manage any future unexpected events from happening. That is very, very important. And as a project manager, you're expected to do that. Always do a risk workshop, which you are going to take through the team, the whole process of risk cycle, which we are going to discuss in the next section. There are a number of tools or documents that you should make sure you are recording in the risk management process in a project. The first one is the risk checklist. I've also added a link on the description below in case you want to download a risk checklist. You can also download it. It's a free download. The second part is what is called a risk register. We are going to go through the risk register in the next section so that you can understand each and every column, each and every information that you have to record in that register. Then the third one is the risk management strategy document. This is a very, very important document which you have to create during the project initiation stage. So we are going to dive in again into these individual tools one by one so that at least you can appreciate them. But before we do that, we need to go through the activities that you have to do earlier before you create a register or even before you create a risk management strategy document. So let's move on to the next section. So in this section, we are going to look at the risk categories. So there are quite a number of risk categories that you can consider in any project, depending also on the industry, depending also on the sector, and also on the type of the project. So we are going to look into a number of them in this section. In this section, I'm not going to go through all the categories that you need in a project because they depend on project to project. They also differ from industry to industry, even from country to country. So I'm just going to look at an example or examples of these categories that you need to consider, but they are very, very important for your project. The first one is environmental. There could be some environmental issues that you have to consider. So therefore, if there's any anticipated risk from the environment section or environment category, therefore, you should be having a category in your risk categories called environmental category. The purpose of this environmental category, I can give you an example. Say, for example, your project might be affected by weather. For example, construction projects can be affected by weather. So if, say, there's going to be some landslides or there's going to be some floods, definitely your project is going to be affected. So you need to consider that as a risk. Say, for example, the risk of having floods is most likely going to affect either the project timelines or even some of the already delivered deliverables. So this is an example of an environmental related category. The second category is going to be on the economic category. For example, you might have a project you are working on. Say, for example, it's building a new product which you want to launch into the market. And due to the market changes or the economic environment changes, maybe there's too much inflation, as an example, prices are going up at a very high rate, or even there's downsizing in terms of production. So definitely that is going to affect your project. You want to launch a new product and the economic environment has changed. So you might be forced to either downscale the project in terms of what you want to produce, in terms of the product, or you might be forced either to change the scope or to reduce the scope of what you're supposed to deliver. So this is how normally the economic environment is going to affect your project. So you should have a category called economic category. Another example of this category is the legal or regulatory environment. So you find that you might be working on a certain project, and on this project, probably you want to come up with a certain process or way of doing things, or you want to produce a new product to enhance or to expand your business. And then there could be a regulatory change. Another certain product will no longer be used in a specific environment, and therefore it won't make any sense for you, either as a project team member or a project manager, to continue with that project. So you'll be forced to stop the project and then consider other options. So that is very important. Another example of a risk category is technological. There are certain projects which are viable because they are based on a specific technology, but as soon as that technology is removed either from the market or it becomes obsolete, it won't be viable for you to continue working on that project. So there's a risk that the technology that you are using is most likely going to change, and if it changes, you also need to assess the impact, and you also need to know the probability of that change to happen. So you must have a category under your risks which is specific to technology. That is very, very important for you as a project manager. So, like I said earlier, a risk can come as an opportunity or positive side, or a risk can come as a threat, which is the negative side. So there are certain specific responses that is expected from either you as a project manager or as a project team member on how you're supposed to respond in case the risk materializes, which means instead of being a risk, it becomes an issue, which means that future event, it has occurred. So how do you react to that? So in this section, I'm going to take you through the two sides of it, the upside and the downside on how to react to a risk once it has happened. So let's move on. There are basically 6 responses that you can apply to any threats or to any negative side of a risk. From my experience, I normally summarize them as RAFT. So you might be wondering, what does it stand for? So A, it stands for avoid. There are certain cases where it becomes very easy for you, either as a project member or project manager, to avoid a specific project totally. For example, if you know that there's a certain technology which is no longer going to be supported in the next 5 or 10 years, it's better you avoid using that technology. You go for something that you know you're going to use for a long time. Another example is, say for example, you're running a project where you're using a machine that is using, for example, a plastic part. In order to avoid either overheating or melting or machine breakdown in future, you might try to avoid that risk by going for something like steel or metallic part to replace the plastic one. So that's how you can avoid a risk in a project. It's very, very important. That's what I normally do in my projects. I always try to make sure that where it's possible, sometimes it's not possible, where it's possible to avoid the risk, avoid it, than to try to manage it in future. You need to take note of that as a project manager. So now we look at the S part of it. S part of it on the threats or the negative part of risk is sharing. I normally see it in the investment scenarios. Say for example, a specific bank, they want to lend money either to a specific multinational company, a big one, or even to a government, a big one. They normally go through what is called syndicated lending. So what does it mean? The exposure of one entity is too much. It might even bring down the entity. Say for example, the exposure is about $4 billion US. So most of the companies would go down if they go for that deal, and then there's some issues in terms of repayment or in terms of the investment materializing. So in that case, you'll find that such kind of risks, they require sharing. So if you're running a project that has got a very high risk, to such an extent that it might even sink your organization or your business entity, it's better to share in case it happens. For example, I've also seen it in some entities, they go for insurance. If you know there's going to be a very serious financial impact, you can also take insurance against it. In case it happens, at least you can recover from the insurance. So these are some of the things where, these are some of the scenarios where you need to share the risk or the impact of the risk. Normally, on the financial side is the easiest way to share the impact. In other cases, you might also want to share the impact by subcontracting. I've seen in some of my projects that I've done, the business or the organization decided to subcontract so that they have a fixed amount they're going to pay. They don't need to pay extra in case there's some unforeseen event that might occur during the process of running the project. So subcontracting is also another option which you can go for in order to share the risk if you're a business entity, especially for high-risk projects that you might want to run as a project manager. So the R for RAFT, it stands for reduce. So as a project manager, there are cases where you need to reduce the risk in a project. I am going to give you a very simple hypothetical scenario, life scenario. If you know that there's going to be a delay in using the road way of getting from one point to the other, you might want to reduce the risk by going through a train or maybe by flying to that place. So you have not avoided the risk, but at least you have reduced it, because you know flying, it might be delayed, but not as much as road traffic. A train might be delayed, but not as high as the road traffic. So that is how you can also reduce risk. There are certain cases where you are not able to reduce the risk. So this is one of the items we're going to discuss as we move on to how do you respond to some of these risks. So reducing a risk also in a project is very important. Like I said earlier, in your workshop, these are some of the questions you should be posing to the participants. How do you reduce some of these risks? How do you share some of these risks? How can you avoid some of these risks? That is very, very important if you can do that. So the next part of it, which is the A for accept. There are certain cases, even in my experience, there are certain cases as a project manager, I had to accept whatever has happened in the project as a risk, because there isn't much that you can do. For example, you might have a high staff turnover in your project, or even death of your key members in a project. There's nothing that you can do. You need to accept it, and then you need to move forward by planning or introducing more people so that you move on with the project. There are certain cases where you cannot control anything. We have seen it with COVID environment. During COVID, no one had planned for a closure of 6 or 5 months or 3 months at all. Everyone was planning to thinking that everything was going to work well. But when COVID hits us, we had no option. We had to accept that we have to stop projects. We had to accept that we have to protect the lives of the project members. So there are so many cases where you have to accept reality. You have to accept that it has happened. There isn't much that you can do but to move on and make sure you deliver the objectives of the project. So it is one of the responses that you also need to consider, especially when there are threats or there are negative impacts of those events. So the other response that you can do to any threats or negative impact of a risk is a fallback. So what do you mean by fallback? This means you are going to allow the risk to happen if you cannot control that, and then once it has happened, you fall back on your plan B or plan C action. For example, you might incorporate additional time in your planning. In case there's a delay or there's a risk of a certain contractor to delay some of the things that you want to use in your project, you can also allow that additional time to cover up for that. The other fallback could be additional budgets. You might also want to have additional budget specifically for risk coverage. In case there is something that is going to happen in the future that is going to affect the current budget, then definitely that budget is going to save you as plan B. Or even you have alternative activities that you need to take. In case this supplier fails to provide a specific product which is very cheap, you might have additional budget to go and buy from the very expensive supplier, but you know that at least within some hours, some days, some weeks, or some months, you're going to get your product. So that is also another form of fallback that you need to consider, especially when you're faced with a risk or a threat which you have no control, but you have to let it happen and then you react from there. I hope you have enjoyed the video so far. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you are the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help this channel to produce more videos like this one. In some cases, it's also worthwhile to transfer the risk to other parties. For example, I think I've said earlier, you might want to transfer the risk of overrunning your budget in a project by subcontracting to either vendors or even to other contractors. So it's also a very normal way to respond to any threats. You have gone through your risk workshop. You have identified that there are certain activities which you are not able to manage. For example, budget. you're expecting that or anticipating that there could be additional money required to do some activities, and you are running on a very strict budget, low budget, and therefore the only way you can do that is to subcontract the effort. In case it's delayed, in case that risk materializes, the subcontractor is the one who is going to bear. Okay? The subcontractor is the one who is going to bear or is going to take care of the additional cost. So you have transferred the risk. There are also some cases, for example, insurance. You know that this is not going to happen very well. If it's going to happen, it's going to sink the organization. So you also transfer that risk. For example, civil unrest. In most cases, civil unrest, they're very costly. So through insurance, you can even transfer that risk when you're running the project. Now, let's move on to the positive side of a risk. Remember our definition of a risk. It's any future event that can occur and affect the project objectives. One of them is sharing. Okay? In case there is some opportunity or there is some positive event, then you can even share with others. You can even share with others within the project. You can share with others outside the project. You can even share with others within the organization or outside the organization. So there could be an opportunity. Maybe you are about to create a certain product. Then there's some technological advancement which brought up some other technology which can provide you or which can enable you to produce better or even more of those products. So you also take advantage of that. Then the next part of it is enhancing. So what do we mean by enhancing? Enhancing is how can you make it better if it happens? Like the earlier example I've given you. You are working on a certain technology which was only going to allow you to produce 2 products at any given time period, say for example 2 months or 3 months. Now there's going to be a change of technology which is going to allow you to produce at least hundreds of those projects or deliverables. So definitely you want to make sure that you enhance, you increase the chances of that happening. Then this third part of how you respond to the positive or the opportunities from a risk is what is called exploit, which means you are going to increase the probability of that happening so that in case it happens, you can make use of it, you can take advantage of it in order to increase the chances of your project. This normally happens especially when you are creating a new product as compared to a construction project or even a software development project or even an event management process, which is also normally run as a project. So you need to exploit what has been coming out of the project. You need to exploit what has been coming out outside the project, and so on and so forth. Then the last part of the upside of a risk happening is also to reject. You also have an opportunity as a project manager when you're running a project to reject a specific risk. It might come as very attractive, but you might have realized that it's only a short-term item, and therefore you reserve your rights to reject the outcome of that in terms of upside. That means you are also in control on whether you should capitalize, you should exploit, you should share, or you should enhance the positive side that is coming out of the project. So that is very, very important to consider as a project manager. So if the risk is going to occur, which areas is it going to affect? Or if it's a set of risks, which areas are going to be affected because of that risk? So that is what we're going to go through this section of the video. So the first part is timeline. As a project manager, you should be able to assess the impact of the risk on the timeline. There are certain risks, if they occur, you might be forced either to stop the project altogether, or you might be forced to scale down in terms of your scope. So that assessment is very, very important. If you are still to deliver the project within the same timeline, and a very major risk has occurred, which becomes an issue, you might be forced to change the scope in order to stay within the timelines. The other section is the cost. You should be able to assess the impact of the risk on the cost. In some cases, some of these risks, if they happen to be on the negative side, they are going to affect the cost. You are going to end up with a project that is going to have a project overrun or budget overrun in a project. So you also need to assess the impact. Like I said earlier, during the workshops, you should be able to assess the impact of each and every risk, especially on the time and also on the cost. That is very, very important for a project manager to consider, especially during the initiation stage of the project, where you are going to be identifying most of these risks, you are going to assess most of these risks. You should consider to assess the impact of each and every risk. Also, on assessing the impact of a risk, you might also need to consider physical resources. There are certain risks if they occur. For example, if it's flooding and you're running a bridge construction project, you are most likely going to have some damages on the physical structure of the building. You are most likely going to have some damages on the physical structure of the bridge. If you are constructing a building or a house, you are most likely going to have the physical structure on that particular house or building. So you need to assess the impact. In case that happens, what are you going to do as a project manager? Or in case that is happening, are you able to avoid it? Remember, we went through the possible categories, we went through the possible responses that might come from you as a project manager. That is very, very important to consider. During the impact assessment, you also need to consider this impact on the staff. There are certain cases where if a specific risk occurs, it will affect the staff morale, definitely. Say, for example, there's a risk that a specific leader in the organization is going to leave, and this leader is the one who was representing most of the staff members in case they had any issues, and that person leaves the organization. That is going to lower the staff morale in the project, because there's going to be some level of uncertainty as to what exactly is going to happen in case there's no immediate replacement with the same caliber as compared to the person who left. Sometimes it can also be demotivating. Say, for example, I've seen it when you're constructing a building, as an example, you reach a certain level, there's a natural disaster like an earthquake, for example, or even there's a landslide, for example, and then the building is damaged. Now we have to start again from the beginning, because you cannot continue on a structure that you know it has got cracks, it has got some weaknesses here and there. So that kind of risk can also pose as a demotivating factor, especially to those who have started the project as compared to those who have just joined the project. So you need to assess the impact of such risks on the staff, the people who are working in the project, the team members who are working in the project. That assessment must be done so that if there's a way you can have plan B in case it happens, then at least you can take it from there. The other consideration when you are assessing the impact of a risk is other projects. I've been in projects where our product was supposed to fit into the next project. So if we were to delay to complete our project, which means our product was never going to be used for the next project. So as a project manager, the assessment, or if you're a project team, what you need to assess is the impact of your project to other projects, especially if you're running a project which is interlinked to other upstream projects. Therefore, you need to assess the impact of each and every risk, because if you don't assess it or you don't plan for it and then it happens, it's going to affect your project either negatively or positively. It will also affect any other projects lined up after your project. So your impact assessment should always consider other projects, mostly the external projects, or there could be projects within a program. So you need to be able to assess the impact. You need to be able to plan for the risk, so that in case it happens, it won't be as devastating as compared to when you're not prepared. That is very, very important for you to consider as a project manager. One of the most important impact assessment you should do to a risk is also on the business level benefit. There are certain risks, if they occur, it will be very, very difficult to justify any business need to continue with the project, any business benefit to continue with the project. So your assessment must be very, very clear, and it must go as deep as business level benefits that they are going to get from that specific project if a specific risk was to occur. So there are certain cases, if that risk was to occur, you can just accept. Remember, we discussed the responses that you can do or you can make to a specific risk. So you can accept and move on. In some cases, you can avoid. So during your risk workshop, make sure that each and every risk that you have identified, you also assess the impact on the business benefit. The next related item is also to make an impact assessment on the timing of the business benefit. Say, for example, you're creating a new product, that's your project, and you have a competitor who is also attempting to create the same product. By any reason, the competitor is ahead of you, they've already managed to create their product, it's already in the market. And you are still maybe 80% of completing your product. You're still running that as a project. So as a project manager, you might be forced either to change the scope in order to meet the market demands. so that your competitor does not go as much as possible. You might want to reduce the expected benefits because your competitor is now ahead of you. So, assessing the impact of business benefits timing is very, very important as a project manager. You need to do this all the way from the beginning of the project up to the end of the project. That impact assessment is very, very important. The next important assessment that you must do as a project manager is the quality. Quality assessment or impact assessment is very, very important. There are certain risks. If they're okay, you might be in trouble in terms of quality. Say, for example, a specific organization was creating some parts that you want to use in your current deliverables. And by any chance, they are no longer going to do that. And you have no other option except to wait for them to provide that specific part. That is also going to affect the project. Or if you decide to change, it might also even affect the quality of the product that you're going to create. For example, you're expecting a steel product to be part of the input into your project, and then all of a sudden you're starting to get plastic parts or products into your project. That is going to affect the quality of your project. For example, you are working on a project to produce a certain product, and most likely there are going to be some electrical faults and the product is half bent, or there are going to be some floods, the product is mixed with water, and so on and so forth. So that is going to compromise quality. So in your impact assessment, you need to make sure that you are assessing if the risk occurs, how likely and to what extent is it going to affect the quality of the project, the quality of the project products, the quality of the project deliverables. That is very, very critical as a project manager to make that assessment well from the beginning of the project all the way up to the project closure. So there are two main measures in a project risk management process. The first one is probability, which is the likelihood of a certain risk to occur. And then the second one is the impact. If it happens, what is going to be the impact? Is it going to be very high, or medium, or low, or very low? So that classification is very, very important. In the next section of the video, I'm going to take you through the concept of this probability impact guide. In some cases, they want to call it a PI grid. So it's a probability impact grid. In short, a PI grid. In project risk management process, there's a very specific definition of what is a risk. You don't need to mix up a risk and an outcome or effect of a risk. So let's dive in to really understand what we mean by this. Normally, a risk is defined with a cause, which means what is going to cause that risk, and also the effect, which is the actual outcome of the risk, and also the event, which is the actual risk. So the sequence is very simple. You start with the cause of the risk, the event, that is the risk that is actually going to happen, and then the effect. I've seen in my experience, there are some project managers who are not really good at defining a risk. If you ask them, what is the risk here? They will just tell you the project will be delayed. Normally, that's not a risk. That's an effect or an outcome of a risk. You should be able to describe the cause of the risk, what is going to happen, which is the event, and what is going to be the effect. For example, you're going to say, if I lose this key member, this specific deliverable is not going to be delivered on time. This specific deliverable is not going to be delivered under the right quality. So at the end of the day, the business or the customer you're working on is going to be unhappy. So that is the complete listing of a risk. What is the cause? You're going to lose a very important stuff. What is the event? Once that stuff is gone, the production of other project deliverables are going to go of low quality. Then what is the implication? The customer or the end user is going to be unhappy. So as a project manager, you should be very clear on how to define what is a risk. A risk is not just any statement. I've seen so many project managers making that mistake. It must have a cause, event, and effect. So I'm going to take you through how do you represent these three items. So the triangle, for example, is what is used to represent a cause. A cause might be linked to one risk or multiple risks that can be triggered by that cause. Even the effect, it might be one or more effects. So this is very, very important for you to master as a project manager. It's not always one-to-one, but sometimes it is one-to-one. You have one cause, you have one event, you have one effect. But what I've seen with my experience, in most cases, you have one cause, multiple events and also multiple effects. So that is very important for you to know, especially during the risk workshop. You should be identifying the effects, you should be identifying the causes. If you want me to create more additional videos based on what we have gone through in terms of techniques, in terms of concepts, or you have got any specific clarifications or questions that you have, let me know in the comment section below.